They say Lucifer was the first to fall, the brightest among the heavenly host, the morning star turned serpent, the rebel prince who refused to bow. But what if he was not the first? What if, before the dragon coiled in Eden, another shadow moved beneath heaven's light? What if there was an angel who fell not from pride, but from fire, a fire of forbidden love, of untold knowledge, of disobedience not out of arrogance, but desire? His name was Azazel. And he may have fallen before Lucifer ever took form. In the earliest days, when the sons of God sang and the stars echoed back their joy, there were watchers set over the earth. Not fallen, not yet corrupt, simply watchers. They observed, they listened. They guarded the thresholds between realms, but among them were those who looked too long upon the daughters of men, who felt not contempt for clay, but longing. And when the veil between heaven and earth thinned, they descended, not as demons, but as angels who chose to taste what they were told to only protect. Azazel was chief among them. He taught men the making of swords. He adorned women with paints and enchantments. He revealed the mysteries of heaven, not to elevate, but to entice. And thus, sin did not begin with a snake. It began with an angel who kissed the earth. The Bible hints. The Quran remains silent, but the book of Enoch cries aloud. It tells of 200 angels who came down in the days of Jad, who took wives, who bore giants Nephilim, who taught mankind magic and metal and madness. It speaks of Azazel bound in the desert, cursed until the day of judgment. A rebel, yes, but not alone, not proud like Iblis, seduced and seductive, and punished not for refusing to bow, but for choosing to touch. Yet this story was hidden, erased. The book of Enoch was once read by early Christians. Jude quoted it, church fathers studied it, but later it was banned, branded apocryphal, buried. Why? Because it contradicted the neat line from Eden to Golgotha, because it showed that sin began not in the garden but in the sky, that angels, not serpents, gave man the tools of rebellion, that evil is not only pride, it is desire, curiosity, longing, and that makes the story harder to control. Islam does not canonize Enoch, but it does speak of Iblis, who refused to bow to Adam, claiming superiority of flame over clay. And it speaks of Harut and Marut, two angels who were sent to Babylon and who taught mankind magic after warning them it was a test. They too were punished. They too fell, but not like Iblis. Their fall was different. Their sin, instructive. The Quran's silence on Azazel is not denial, it is a veil. And behind that veil may lie the first rebellion, the one before Lucifer, the one that taught him how to fall. So we ask, who truly rebelled first? The proud or the passionate, the dragon or the watcher? And if Azazel did fall before Lucifer, what does that mean for our understanding of evil, of temptation, of history itself? The Bible says Lucifer fell from heaven like lightning. The Quran says Iblis was cast down for arrogance. The book of Enoch says Azazel taught sin to men before either. So which is true? Did sin begin in Eden or in the skies above it? Was Eve deceived by a serpent, or was her desire kindled by teachings from the Watchers? Did Lucifer invent rebellion, or did he inherit it? What if the first fall was not pride, but passion? What if the oldest rebel was not Lucifer, but Azazel? And if so, what does that make the world we live in? Tonight we begin the journey not with Lucifer, but before him, into stories banned from the Bible, hinted in the Quran, preserved in fragments and fear. We do not seek to destroy belief, but to uncover what belief may have buried. For in the silence between the texts, in the shadows of canon, the prophets may still speak, and their voices may tell a different story. So we begin with 7 hidden tales. 7 contradictions between scripture and spirit. 7 cracks in the story we were told. And the first is the forgotten fall of Azazel. But what if these stories were never meant to agree? They say Lucifer was the first to fall, the brightest among the heavenly host, the morning star turned serpent, the rebel prince who refused to bow. But what if he was not the first? What if, before the dragon coiled in Eden, another shadow moved beneath heaven's light? What if there was an angel who fell not from pride, but from fire, a fire of forbidden love, of untold knowledge, of disobedience not out of arrogance, but desire. His name was Azazel. And he may have fallen before Lucifer ever took form. In the earliest days, when the sons of God sang and the stars echoed back their joy, there were watchers set over the earth. Not fallen, not yet corrupt, simply watchers. They observed, they listened. They guarded the thresholds between realms, but among them were those who looked too long upon the daughters of men, who felt not contempt for clay, but longing. And when the veil between heaven and earth thinned, they descended, not as demons, but as angels who chose to taste what they were told to only protect. Azazel was chief among them. He taught men the making of swords. He adorned women with paints and enchantments. He revealed the mysteries of heaven, not to elevate, but to entice. And thus, sin did not begin with a snake. It began with an angel who kissed the earth. The Bible hints. The Quran remains silent, but the book of Enoch cries aloud. It tells of 200 angels who came down in the days of Jad, who took wives, who bore giants, Nephilim who taught mankind magic and metal and madness. It speaks of Azazel bound in the desert, cursed until the day of judgment. A rebel, yes, but not alone, not proud like Iblis, seduced and seductive, and punished not for refusing to bow, but for choosing to touch. Yet this story was hidden, erased. The book of Enoch was once read by early Christians. Jude quoted it. Church fathers studied it, but later it was banned, branded apocryphal, buried. Why? Because it contradicted the neat line from Eden to Golgotha, because it showed that sin began not in the garden but in the sky, that angels, not serpents, gave man the tools of rebellion, that evil is not only pride, it is desire, curiosity, longing, and that makes the story harder to control. Islam does not canonize Enoch, but it does speak of Iblis, who refused to bow to Adam, claiming superiority of flame over clay. And it speaks of Harut and Marut, two angels who were sent to Babylon and who taught mankind magic after warning them it was a test. They too were punished. They too fell, but not like Iblis. Their fall was different, their sin instructive. The Quran's silence on Azazel is not denial, it is a veil, and behind that veil may lie the first rebellion, the one before Lucifer. One that taught him how to fall. So we ask, who truly rebelled first, the proud or the passionate, the dragon or the watcher? And if Azazel did fall before Lucifer, what does that mean for our understanding of evil, of temptation, of history itself? The Bible says Lucifer fell from heaven like lightning. The Quran says Iblis was cast down for arrogance. The book of Enoch says Azazel taught sin to men before either. So which is true? Did sin begin in Eden or in the skies above it? Was Eve deceived by a serpent, or was her desire kindled by teachings from the Watchers? Did Lucifer invent rebellion, or did he inherit it? What if the first fall was not pride, but passion? What if the oldest rebel was not Lucifer, but Azazel? And if so, what does that make the world we live in? Tonight, we begin the journey not with Lucifer, but before him, into stories banned from the Bible, hinted in the Quran, preserved in fragments and fear. We do not seek to destroy belief, but to uncover what belief may have buried. For in the silence between the texts, in the shadows of canon, the prophets may still speak, and their voices may tell a different story. So we begin with 7 hidden tales, 7 contradictions between scripture and spirit, 7 cracks in the story we were told. And the first is the forgotten fall of Azazel. But what if these stories were never meant to agree? They say Lucifer was the first to fall, the brightest among the heavenly host, the morning star turned serpent, the rebel prince who refused to bow. But what if he was not the first? What if, before the dragon coiled in Eden, another shadow moved beneath heaven's light? What if there was an angel who fell not from pride, but from fire, a fire of forbidden love, of untold knowledge, of disobedience not born of arrogance, but of longing? For his name was Azazel. And he may have fallen before Lucifer ever took form. In the earliest days when the sons of God sang and the stars echoed back their joy, watchers were assigned over the earth, not yet fallen, not yet corrupt, only observers of creation. They listened and guarded the veils between realms. But among them were those who looked too long at the daughters of men, and what they saw did not inspire disdain but desire. And when the barrier between heaven and earth thinned, they descended, not as demons, but as angels who chose experience over obedience. Azazel was chief among them. He taught mankind the forging of blades and the painting of eyes. He whispered secrets of heaven not to elevate, but to seduce. And so sin did not begin with a serpent, but with an angel who knelt to kiss the dust. The Bible hints at such things. The Quran remains mostly silent, but the Book of Enoch cries aloud, telling of 200 angels who came down in the days of Jad, who took wives for themselves and bore giants, Nephilim, who spread knowledge of enchantment, war, and deception. And Azazel was named among them, bound in the desert and cursed until the day of judgment, a rebel punished not for refusing to bow but for choosing to touch. Yet this story was hidden and erased, for the Book of Enoch was once revered, even quoted in the Epistle of Jude, studied by the early church fathers, but later rejected and declared apocryphal. Buried not because it lacked truth, but because it carried too much of it, for it disrupted the tidy arc from Eden to Calvary, and revealed that the first sin may not have been born in a garden, but in the sky, that angels, not serpents, gave mankind its earliest tools of rebellion, and that the origin of evil was not pride alone, but desire, curiosity, hunger to know, and that makes the story more dangerous, more human. Islam does not preserve the Book of Enoch as scripture, but its echoes live in Quranic hints, in the story of Iblis who refused to bow to Adam, claiming that flame was greater than clay, in the brief verses about Harut and Marut, angels who taught sorcery as a test, who fell not like Iblis but in sorrow and surrender, and the Quran's silence on Azazel is not a rejection, it is a veil, and behind that veil may lie the first fall, the one that taught Lucifer the shape of rebellion. So we ask, who truly fell first? Was it the proud or the passionate, the one who claimed superiority or the one who broke the rules for love? Did Lucifer invent rebellion or did he inherit it? And if Azazel fell before the serpent ever slithered, then what does that make our entire history of good and evil? For the Bible says Lucifer fell like lightning, the Quran says Iblis was cast out for arrogance, but the Book of Enoch says Azazel corrupted creation long before either. So which is true? Did sin begin with Eve or with angels? Was the first temptation a fruit or a flame? What if the first rebellion was not born of defiance, but of longing? What if the fall began not with pride, but with passion? And what if Azazel was the first to cross the line? Then Lucifer only followed. Tonight we begin not with Lucifer, but before him, into stories that were silenced, into scriptures that were buried, into contradictions not to destroy faith, but to deepen it. For in the cracks between what was told and what was hidden, the truth often speaks in whispers, and the prophets may still echo from the shadows. 7 stories await us, 7 forbidden tales, 7 contradictions between scripture and soul, and the first begins with the one who fell not in fire, but in touch, Azazel, the watcher who became the first rebel. And so we ask gently but firmly, what if these stories were never meant to agree? In the ancient scriptures, buried beneath time and translation, there lingers a tale older than Eden, whispered by stones and winds long forgotten. The Bible speaks often of Lucifer, the fallen angel who became the serpent of Genesis, the proud one who refused to serve, cast down from heaven for his rebellion. But before his name ever echoed through scripture, the Book of Enoch tells of a different fall, more primal, more intimate, and more terrifying. For this fall was not rooted in pride, but in longing, not in rebellion for glory, but in rebellion for love. In the days of Jad, before Noah's ark touched water, before the flood cleansed a blood-soaked world, a company of angels known as the Watchers looked upon the daughters of men and were drawn not to their sin, but to their beauty. Among them was Azazel, a name ancient and electric, a being of light whose eyes burned with knowledge forbidden to earth. He was not cast down for refusing God's command, but for choosing to descend. He came not with weapons, but with gifts, secrets of the heavens poured into mortal hands. He taught men to forge swords, to make mirrors, to paint the eyes of women, to twist beauty into seduction and wonder into war. The Book of Enoch accuses him of corrupting all flesh, of leading both man and angel astray, of being bound in darkness until the day of final judgment. He was not alone. 200 others followed, but it was Azazel whose name burned brightest in blame. And yet, for all the weight of his crime, the Bible as it exists now is strangely silent. Genesis hints at giants, at Nephilim born of heavenly fathers and earthly mothers, but it does not name them. The Church declared the Book of Enoch heretical, its stories too wild, too raw, too unsettling for the growing orthodoxy of a faith that needed order more than truth. And so Azazel disappeared from the Christian canon, his story buried in caves and dust, his name left to the shadows of Apocrypha, while Lucifer rose to take center stage as the singular symbol of celestial rebellion. But the Quran, though it does not name Azazel, echoes his fall in subtle strokes. It speaks of Iblis, a jinn among angels, who refused to bow to Adam, claiming that fire was superior to clay. His rebellion was one of pride, of hierarchy, of self-exaltation. But then the Quran also tells of Harut and Marut, two angels sent to Babylon who taught mankind sorcery as a test, who warned that their knowledge was a trial, not a gift, and who, by some traditions, were punished for what they revealed. These stories do not align perfectly with Azazel, but they form a constellation of fallen instruction, a cosmic pattern of beings who crossed the line between heaven and earth and bore the consequences. Islam does not speak of angels lusting after humans, for angels in Islam do not sin, but it does record the idea of knowledge given as test, of descent as trial, of light turned dangerous. Azazel, in this framework, fits not as an angel in Islamic terms, but perhaps as a jinn or a being whose role was twisted by desire. What matters is that the concept of divine knowledge used to corrupt aligns across these stories. And so, while Christianity remembers only Lucifer, Islam acknowledges a more nuanced narrative of rebellion, pride, yes, but also the peril of knowledge, the test of descent, the warning against overreaching. The bold question then emerges: what if Lucifer was not the first? What if his rebellion was not original, but a repetition? What if he learned from Azazel, saw how the Watchers came down, saw how knowledge became poison, and followed that path not as innovator, but as imitator? And if so, what does that say about the nature of evil itself? That it is not always born of defiance, but often of desire. That the oldest sin may not have been pride, but fascination. That before the serpent slithered, an angel whispered secrets. That rebellion began not with a refusal to bow, but with a hunger to touch. The desert winds carried the memory of his fall like ash blown across millennia. For Azazel was not forgotten by those who remembered in silence, not by the scroll keepers hidden in caves, nor by the mystics who studied the strange erosion of divine order in the days before the flood. Because even as the world was still young, and the blood of Adam's line had barely begun to root itself into tribes and cities, Azazel's influence had already seeped deep into the human soul. He was not a beast nor a tyrant, but a teacher, a corrupter cloaked as a mentor, revealing to men what they were never meant to hold: how to wound with iron, how to ensnare the eye with coal, how to manipulate metals and stars and herbs to invoke spirits, shape omens, summon power, and in doing so, he birthed a world where mankind could defy heaven without needing to deny it. Because Azazel did not tempt man to rebel against God, he taught man how to rebel with knowledge. He did not say disobey, he said ascend. He offered imitation of divinity not through denial but through imitation. And it was this perversion of sacred light that made his fall different than Iblis, because Iblis said, "I am better," and refused to bow, but Azazel said, "You can be more," and offered heaven's secrets to dust-bound beings. And this distinction is what echoes dangerously through the pages of hidden texts and apocryphal records. For in the Book of Enoch, the punishment is not merely banishment, but cosmic binding, chains upon his form, darkness sealed over his name, and a curse passed down not just to him, but to all the children of the Watchers, the giants, the Nephilim, whose blood made the earth groan with violence until the flood was sent to purge it. Yet this catastrophe was not explained in the canon with the full weight of its supernatural origin. Genesis reduces it to corruption and evil thoughts, omitting the celestial crime that precipitated it, and so the Church, over time, turned Azazel into a myth, or worse, a scapegoat, a ritual symbol sent into the wilderness on the Day of Atonement, its significance diluted until only the name remained in Leviticus, where the goat is cast out bearing the sins of Israel. Yet few ask why a goat is sent to Azazel in the first place, why the name is preserved in that one verse, if he never mattered, never existed, never fell. And while Christianity buried this, Islam preserved the principle though not the figure, for the Quran says nothing of Azazel directly, but it preserves the idea of sacred knowledge being withheld for a reason. It speaks of how magic was taught to mankind in Babylon as a test, not a blessing, how the angels Harut and Marut warned not to use what they taught, and in these verses lies the spiritual architecture that matches Azazel's tale, a being entrusted with power who becomes the vector for trial. A heavenly messenger who crosses into forbidden influence, and though Islam teaches that angels do not disobey, some interpretations hold that Harut and Marut were allowed to fall temporarily to teach a lesson, which mirrors Azazel's own path, and here the convergence becomes clear. Islam does not need to name Azazel to affirm his pattern, because it already teaches that knowledge is a trust, and when misused it becomes destruction, and the Quran's emphasis on submission protects from this very path. For while Azazel gave man tools to become gods, Islam teaches man to surrender to the only true God, and the contrast becomes staggering, because if the Bible erased this story and the Church hid its danger, and if Islam preserved the lesson while correcting the myth, then which record truly guards against the original deception? And more daring still is the question. If Lucifer's pride was his downfall, and Azazel's desire was his, then what is the deeper root of rebellion, arrogance or ambition, defiance or curiosity? And if Azazel gave man knowledge before Lucifer gave him temptation, then who truly set the world on fire? Who gave us war, sorcery, vanity, division? If the Quran warns against hidden knowledge and affirms that power comes only by permission, then why did Christianity preserve only the serpent and forget the teacher? And what if the real origin of evil was not a talking snake in Eden, but an angel whispering to mankind long before the garden ever bloomed? What if Azazel's fall was not only first, but foundational, the blueprint of corruption itself? And what if the greatest danger to the soul is not to refuse to bow, but to teach others how to rise without God? Azazel's name echoes not through the sermons of the church nor the lectures of the mosque, but through the margins of memory, through exiled scrolls and vanished chants, and yet the stain of his fall remains painted across history like ash smudged over prophecy, because long before Lucifer was blamed for the serpent's hiss, Azazel had already twisted heaven's light into a weapon of seduction and war, and though time has tried to fold him into mythology, his fingerprints remain on every altar built to power. Every system that values knowledge without humility, every blade forged not to protect but to conquer, because Azazel's sin was not to curse God, but to give divine knowledge without divine permission. And what makes his story more dangerous than that of Lucifer is not that he fell farther, but that he fell more quietly, without the drama of heavenly war or the declaration of arrogance. And that is why his influence persists, because it was never branded as rebellion, it was disguised as enlightenment. And herein lies the hidden threat, the soft rebellion that does not roar but whispers, that does not declare war on heaven, but hands out the tools to build Babel. And while Christianity demonized Lucifer, it obscured Azazel, perhaps because his tale struck too close to the institutions of priest and scholar, because to admit Azazel corrupted the world through sacred instruction would cast shadows on all those who claim to speak on behalf of the divine. And so his tale was reduced to a scapegoat sent into the wilderness, a ritual cleansing with no context, his true identity swallowed by the canon, and yet Islam preserved the deeper logic of his story, not through his name, but through the weight it gave to knowledge, the restrictions it placed around divine secrets, the idea that what is sacred must be guarded, not marketed, that power without surrender leads only to ruin, and that even those entrusted with truth can fall when they cease to seek God's pleasure. And when we compare the two faiths, a terrifying irony appears. Christianity erased the story of the angel who corrupted man through knowledge and chose, instead, the story of the angel who tempted man through pride. Yet Islam warns of both, the pride of Iblis and the trial of Harut and Marut, the arrogance of refusing to bow and the danger of misused wisdom. And so we must ask, what kind of narrative do we inherit when we ignore Azazel, when we simplify the origin of evil into a single rebellion of pride, when we erase the subtle rebellion of gifting man forbidden tools in the name of fascination and beauty? What kind of theology is built when the origin of corruption is made into a children's tale about a fruit and a snake, when the deeper wounds of history were carved not by deception, but by instruction, not by seduction, but by sacred betrayal. And what kind of redemption is promised when the story begins with the wrong villain? For if Azazel corrupted mankind before Lucifer tempted Eve, then sin did not begin in Eden, it began in the sky. And if the Quran preserves the principle while the Bible erases the name, then which faith has truly remembered the truth? And if Islam protects the sacredness of knowledge with divine law, while Christianity elevates salvation through blood without safeguarding revelation? Then who preserved the legacy of heaven's first warning? And what if the world was not broken by a bite, but by a gift, not by a serpent, but by a teacher? And what if the true fall of man was not through disobedience, but through unauthorized enlightenment? And what if the greatest deception of all was not Lucifer pretending to be God, but the church pretending that Azazel never existed? And so we close the first tale not with certainty, but with suspicion. That perhaps the origin of our ruin was not pride, but unpermitted light, and if so, then the path back is not through worship of the fallen, but through submission to the one who never fell. In the beginning, before the formation of stars and the setting of orbits, before light split darkness and breath filled lungs, there existed only the throne and those permitted to orbit it, the heavenly host who sang without fatigue, beings of light molded not by dust but by command. And among them stood one whose brilliance outshone his peers, the one later named Lucifer, the morning star, perfect in beauty and wisdom, anointed cherub who walked in the fiery stones of heaven. As described in the cryptic poetry of Ezekiel and Isaiah, though never named outright, his fall hinted not in Genesis, but in scattered verses that Christians would later assemble into a tale of cosmic pride. They say he sought the throne, they say he declared, "I will ascend above the clouds, I will be like the Most High." And for this, he was cast down like lightning, turned from angel to adversary, from morning star to prince of darkness. And yet even this story is built not upon Genesis, which speaks of a serpent, but not a fallen angel, and the serpent's true identity is never explained in the earliest chapters, leading to the question: if Lucifer fell before Eden, where is that story told? If he rebelled before time, why is his tale so fragmented? And here enters the Islamic account, not as contradiction but as clarity. For in the Quran, the being who refused to bow was not an angel but Iblis, a jinn made of smokeless fire, present among the angels but not of their kind, ordered to prostrate to Adam and refusing, not out of ambition for the throne, but out of contempt for clay. And this distinction is essential. For in Islam, angels do not disobey, they are made to serve. And Iblis, being of free will, becomes the template for arrogance, declaring, "I am better than him." And his fall is not a war in heaven but a singular moment of refusal, a choice made in pride. And his punishment is banishment, not death, extended life until the day of judgment, time to tempt and whisper and lure. And while the Bible suggests a celestial rebellion, a third of the angels falling with Lucifer, Islam mentions no such war, no mass revolt among the obedient ones. Instead, it presents Iblis as alone in his defiance, isolated in arrogance. And this raises a fundamental tension between the two scriptures. For if the Bible teaches that Satan's rebellion preceded man, that he fell and then came to tempt, while the Quran teaches that his fall was triggered by the command to bow to man, then which came first, the fall or the creation of Adam? And if the Islamic account places the first act of disobedience after Adam's creation, then the cosmic timeline shifts entirely. The first act of rebellion in the universe was not an angel challenging God for his throne, but a being of fire refusing to honor the one shaped by divine hands. And this reframing is more than theological. It reshapes the nature of evil itself. For if Lucifer's fall was ambition for godhood, then evil is about power. But if Iblis's fall was contempt for man, then evil is about pride, about refusing to accept God's chosen order. And yet beneath both stories, a deeper question pulses. Why was the command to bow given at all? Why would God ask heavenly beings to show reverence to clay, unless the purpose was to reveal what lay hidden in the hearts of the proud? And so the act that caused Iblis to fall was not merely a test of obedience, it was a mirror. And he failed not just by refusing, but by revealing his inner disease. And this is where the Bible falls strangely silent, never explaining why the serpent is there in Eden, why he has knowledge, why he speaks. Why God permits it, while Islam provides a full account, naming the tempter, recording the dialogue, clarifying his origin, and preserving God's absolute authority throughout. For in the Quran, no rebellion weakens the throne, no war fractures heaven, no drama of light and darkness rivals the sovereignty of the Most High. And so the first fall becomes not a mythic tragedy of divine rebellion, but a moral revelation, exposing the roots of arrogance before mankind takes its first breath. And this matters deeply, because if Christianity builds its theology upon a war in heaven that Scripture only hints at, while Islam corrects the sequence and protects the sanctity of angelic obedience, then the foundation of Satan's identity is not just different, it is incompatible, and we are left with this question burning at the heart of both traditions. Did evil enter the world through ambition to be God, or through refusal to honor what God made? And what if the throne was never challenged? What if the first sin was not conquest, but contempt, not rebellion for power, but rebellion against divine choice? And if the Quran remembers the truth while the Bible forgets the sequence, then who truly tells the story of the first fall? The silence before that first refusal was not the silence of peace, but the silence before the unveiling of hearts. For when God announced to the angels, "I am creating a human being from clay," there was no protest, no trembling, only trust, because angels in the Quran are obedient by design, incapable of defiance, and they asked not out of rebellion but curiosity, "Will you place in it one who will cause corruption and shed blood while we glorify you?" And God replied, "I know what you do not know." And this exchange was not a challenge, but a revelation that knowledge does not always flow upward, that submission sometimes precedes understanding. And so when the command was issued, "Bow to Adam," all the angels did as told, but one among them, not of their kind, refused, for Iblis, the jinn who had worshipped long and stood among the ranks of the luminous, could not stomach the sight of prostration before something so base, so fragile, so earthy. And his reasoning was laced with poison disguised as logic. "I am better than him, you created me from fire and him from clay." And in that single sentence, the disease of comparison, the arrogance of origin, the pride of form over obedience was exposed, and God's response was immediate. "Get down from here, for it is not for you to be arrogant here." And thus the first exile was not from earth to hell, but from heaven's honor to disgrace. Yet Iblis did not deny God. He did not question God's power, he only rejected the command, and still he was cast out, which reveals that in the divine court, disobedience is not softened by belief in God's existence. And this is where Islam draws a sharper line than Christianity, because the biblical serpent is not directly connected to Satan until much later interpretations. And even then, his presence in the garden is unexplained, his authority is unquestioned, and his punishment is vague. But in Islam, Iblis's role is detailed, his motives unveiled, his dialogue recorded, and his defiance punished with both justice and delay. For when he was cast down, he asked for respite, time to prove his theory that mankind would not remain loyal, and God granted it, not because Iblis deserved it, but because his trial would become humanity's test. And this moment is not portrayed as divine vulnerability, but divine mastery, allowing evil to operate only within divine permission. And this correction matters, because Christianity paints Satan as a fallen angel who operates outside the framework, wagging war against God's plan, tempting, corrupting, leading souls to eternal fire, often as if he were an independent power in a cosmic struggle. But Islam maintains that even Iblis serves a purpose. Even his whispers are part of a larger orchestration, not to damn man, but to reveal his choices, and this shifts the entire theological lens. From a God battling a rival to a God exposing hearts. And if we examine the consequences of these narratives, we find that the Christian portrayal often creates a dualistic tension. Good versus evil, God versus Satan, a war that makes heaven seem unstable, while the Islamic framework preserves the unity of divine will, where even the defiant are under control, and their rebellion becomes part of the divine test. And yet, despite this clarity, modern theology still wrestles with Satan's origin, for the Bible does not say he was a jinn, nor does it distinguish between angel and fallen one, and traditions emerge to fill the silence, while Islam resolved the confusion from the start by stating clearly that angels cannot disobey, that Iblis was not of their kind, and that rebellion was not a crack in heaven's floor but a mirror of pride. And when Adam was placed in the garden, it was not just paradise, it was the stage for choice. And when Iblis whispered, he did not appear as a serpent coiled in secrecy, but as an enemy already known, and the Quran records this plainly: he is a clear enemy to you, and his promise was deception, not because he lied about the tree, but because he used truth to twist trust, saying, "Shall I direct you to a tree of eternity and a kingdom that will never decay?" And Adam, not yet armed with the full strength of experience, faltered and ate, and the result was not a curse upon all mankind, but a chance to repent, and he did, and was forgiven. And this is another fundamental divide, for Christianity teaches that Adam's sin tainted all who came after, that his fall necessitated a blood sacrifice to redeem generations unborn, but Islam teaches personal accountability, that no soul bears the burden of another. That Adam was taught how to turn back, and that this is the essence of being human, not to never fall, but to return after falling. And if this is so, then the first fall was not a tragedy to be mourned eternally, but a lesson to be remembered, that Iblis's rebellion was refusal, and Adam was forgetfulness, and their destinies diverged because one justified while the other repented. And so the story of the first fall becomes not about damnation, but about distinction. Between pride and humility, between stubbornness and return, and this makes the Islamic narrative not only clearer but deeper, protecting God's sovereignty, affirming his justice, and preserving human dignity without mythologizing sin. And so we must ask again: if the Bible's version of the fall leaves too many gaps, if it builds a cosmic war around fragments, and if Islam resolves the confusion without contradiction, then which story truly reflects the divine origin of choice? And what if the first fall was never about a war in heaven, but about the unveiling of hearts on earth? What if evil did not rise from ambition, but from envy, not from a battle, but from a single refusal? And what if the Quran preserved not just the story, but the truth the Bible forgot to write? The final moments before the fall were not shouted across the skies. There were no angelic armies drawn in defiance, no thunderous ruptures in the celestial veil. There was only one being standing still while all others bowed, one breath held in silent pride as the rest of the creation surrendered to a command. And in that breath, eternity shifted, for Iblis, though made of fire, burned not with light, but with comparison. And it was that comparison that forged the first fracture in the unity of the divine court. For while the Christian tradition imagines a great rebellion, a cosmic insurrection led by Lucifer and a third of the angels, the Quran presents a more terrifyingly intimate story. One creature alone, hearing the voice of God directly and still saying no, not because he did not believe, but because belief without submission is not obedience. And though the church teaches that Lucifer was an angel of high rank, cast down for seeking the throne, the Bible never offers a full account, only scattered verses stitched together across Isaiah, Ezekiel, and Revelation, none of which mention Eden or angels turning into devils or prideful light-bearers turning into serpents. And thus Lucifer becomes more tradition than text, more assumption than revelation, a villain born in the silence between scriptures. While Iblis in the Quran is named, his refusal quoted, his punishment recorded, his request granted, and his purpose defined. And when God asked him why he did not bow, his answer was not confusion but conviction: I am better than him. And that statement is the root of every sin that would follow in human history. For what Iblis introduced into the divine order was not just arrogance, but hierarchy rooted in essence: fire versus clay, form over obedience, creation over command. And that poison has dripped down into the veins of nations and castes and empires ever since. And so his sin was not merely pride. It was the blueprint of racism, classism, elitism, every ideology that claims inherent superiority over another. And this is why God condemned him not only for disobedience but for arrogance. And while the church placed the serpent in Eden as a cunning external deceiver, Islam places Iblis as the known enemy, already defined, already exposed, and yet permitted to whisper as a test. And this distinction is monumental, Because in the biblical framework, Satan operates as a rival force, a corrupted angel now empowered to damn, while in Islam, Iblis is under divine decree, his mission allowed but limited, his rebellion not victorious but tolerated for a time, and he is not a being who tempts by possession or by overwhelming might, but by suggestion, by waswasa, whispering into the hearts of men, and this makes him far more dangerous, for he does not need horns or thrones or armies, only your attention. And the fact that he refused to bow to Adam is not just a moment in a story. It is a prophecy of how he would continue to operate, refusing to acknowledge human dignity, whispering doubts into the hearts of those who seek worth, suggesting always that they are less, that they are flawed, that they are unworthy, and it is this voice that echoes in the ears of those who fall into despair, who forget that God honored Adam above even the angels, who forget that their worth was divinely affirmed at the moment of their creation, and this is why the Quran tells the story with such clarity, because it is not just about the past. It is about the present, the battle within the self, the refusal of Iblis mirrored every time we look down on others, every time we elevate our form above obedience, and so the fall is not a myth. It is a mirror, and in that mirror we must ask, why does the Bible leave so much unsaid? Why does it allow tradition to build a cosmic drama that contradicts its own silence? Why does it not tell us who the serpent is, or where he came from, or why he speaks with knowledge of good and evil? Why must readers stitch together fragments to build Lucifer's biography, when the Quran unfolds the story from beginning to end without ambiguity? And if that is so, then we are left not just with two different Satans, but two different theologies entirely, one that depicts a fractured heaven and an angelic civil war, and another that preserves the perfection of the divine realm while locating the test within the self. And we must ask, which vision truly honors the sovereignty of God? Which account affirms that nothing happens except by His will? And if Christianity built its enemy on verses never meant to be joined, while Islam named him, explained him, and limited him, then who has preserved the real adversary? And what if Satan was never an angel of light turned devil, but a jinn who failed a test? What if the first fall was not a spectacle, but a single word unsaid? What if the battle is not between God and Satan, but between man and the whisper? And if so, then who do we blame for our descent? The one who whispered, or the one who listened? There is a silence in the Bible where thunder should be, a missing name where judgment begins. For in the book of Leviticus, on the Day of Atonement, a strange figure is introduced not as man, prophet, or demon, but as destination, Azazel, the name whispered into the ears of the scapegoat before it is sent into the wilderness. And though later translations bury it beneath euphemism, calling it the wilderness or the cliff, the Hebrew text is stubborn. It names him plainly to Azazel, and offers no explanation, no lineage, no story, only the eerie certainty that this being is the one to whom sins are symbolically transferred. And the goat is not sacrificed to God. It is cast away alive to this shadowed being in the wild. And from this singular appearance, a question rises like smoke. Who is Azazel, and why does God's ritual involve sending sin toward him? For if he is metaphor, why name him? And if he is real, why interact? And the Bible answers neither, offering instead only ritual and mystery. And yet beyond the canon, in the banned scrolls, in the Book of Enoch hidden for centuries in Ethiopian monasteries, Azazel's name explodes like a buried star, revealed not as a symbol but a being of flame, a leader among the Watchers, the angels who descended to earth and took human wives, who taught forbidden knowledge and corrupted mankind before the flood. And it is he whom Enoch blames for the fall of creation. He who taught men the making of weapons, adorned women with sorcery, revealed secrets meant only for heaven, and turned beauty into vanity and war into worship. And for these crimes he was bound, cast into a pit in the desert, eyes covered, hands chained, until the end of time, and the judgment upon him is so severe that it rivals that of Iblis himself. Yet the church erased his story, the councils declared Enoch apocryphal, and the name Azazel was left as a ritual ghost, unexplained, unchallenged, until only the scapegoat remained. But Islam, though it does not name him, echoes his shadow in pieces. For while the Quran never says Azazel, it speaks of angels who disobeyed through a test. It speaks of Harut and Marut sent to Babylon with knowledge of magic. teaching only with warning and causing fitna among the people, and it speaks of shayatin among jinn and mankind who whisper and deceive, and of a figure hurled from heaven who now roams, cursed and determined to mislead. And while these are not confirmations, they are harmonics, pieces of a shape hidden behind the veil. And if Azazel taught men sorcery, Islam forbids it harshly, condemning it not as myth but as crime, and the Quran speaks of those who traded their souls for illusions, learning what harms, not what benefits, and suffering for the lies they embraced. And so even without his name, the Quran defends the truth Azazel's story once carried. That sacred knowledge when misused becomes corruption, that light when offered without permission burns, and that the rebellion of heaven was not only pride but pollution. And if the Bible hides his identity, and the church removed his scroll, and only a ritual remains pointing to the abyss, then the question is not whether Azazel existed, but why we were never told. Why was the angel blamed for the first corruption erased, while the devil who followed was elevated? Why was the one who opened the gates of hell with the keys of knowledge forgotten, while the one who whispered in Eden became theology's center? And what if that forgetting was not innocent? What if the first rebellion was not loud and proud like Lucifer, but quiet and seductive, a rebellion of instruction, not opposition? And what if Azazel was not just another fallen being, but the first to weaponize wisdom, the first to sin by teaching, the first to rebel by unveiling heaven's order without consent? And what if the reason he is buried is because he exposes a more terrifying truth, not that evil tempts, but that evil teaches, and that the worst betrayal is not refusal to bow, but corruption through guidance? And if the Quran preserves the warning even without the name, and the Bible retains only the ritual but not the context, then which text truly protects us from the abyss? And what if the goat was not sent into emptiness, but sent home? The wilderness that received the goat was not empty. It was not merely rocks and wind and desert silence. It was a gate, an altar turned inside out, a place where heaven's light did not reach. And when the goat was sent to Azazel, it was not to cleanse sin, but to cast it toward its source, to return it to the one who first opened the gates of corruption with open hands and hidden fire. For Azazel's rebellion was never loud like Iblis's refusal. It was quiet, wrapped in beauty, buried in brilliance, cloaked in gifts disguised as teachings, and this made him more dangerous than any devil. For while Lucifer is remembered for pride, Azazel is remembered only by the few for seduction, not of the flesh, but of the soul, not of the senses, but of sacred boundaries. And it was this seduction that gave birth to a world where men forged swords before they understood peace, where women adorned themselves with charms before they were taught prayer, where spirits were summoned before they were feared. And knowledge bloomed not as mercy but as control. And in the book of Enoch, it is Azazel who leads this transformation, not as a rebel in open war, but as a teacher in dissent, stepping across the line that separates heaven from earth, not to destroy, but to enlighten prematurely. And the punishment that follows is not just upon him, but upon all the world, for the watchers who followed him, the giants they sired, the destruction they caused, all culminated in the flood. Not as nature's wrath, but as divine judgment. And yet this story was too complex, too celestial, too dangerous to be canonized. And so it was buried, its scroll declared heresy, its characters dissolved into metaphor, until only the scapegoat remained in ritual without memory. But Islam, even in silence, preserves the principle. And while the Quran does not mention Azazel, it reveals a divine pattern where knowledge is protected, where angels do not disobey unless allowed, where Harut and Marut descend not to rebel but to test, and even they say, "We are only a trial, so do not disbelieve," and still they are remembered as those who opened a door to darkness. And this door mirrors Azazel's, a descent for a lesson that became a curse. And the Quran warns again and again that knowledge is not always mercy, that the unseen is not for casual exploration, that revelation is sacred trust, not private conquest. And in this way, Islam affirms the shadow of Azazel without naming him, and binds his actions into the framework of divine caution, where every secret has a guardian, and every guardian has a limit, and those who cross it become not gods but warnings. And so we see that Azazel's rebellion was not about defiance. It was about unauthorized giving, and this flips the very concept of evil, for he did not curse God, he did not claim superiority, he simply gave what was not his to give, and corrupted what was not yet ready to receive. And this echoes across every age, in every place where truth is sold without purification, where sacred words are used for control, where symbols are traded as spells, and faith is replaced by fascination. And so Azazel's fall becomes a prophecy of religion misused, knowledge unanchored, guidance sold before it was earned. And this is the abyss, not a place but a pattern, not a destination but a descent. And if the church erased him because his tales struck too close to their towers of theology, and if the Bible left only a goat to bear his name, while the Quran preserves his silhouette through principles and preserved warnings, then we must ask, which revelation kept the warning alive, and why has the world forgotten the angel who taught men how to destroy in the name of knowledge? And why do we still fear devils that roar, when the most dangerous ones only whisper and teach? And what if the abyss is not beneath us, but already inside us? And what if Azazel's rebellion was not a moment in history, but the model that continues every time we share what should be sacred and twist it into spectacle? And what if the truest evil is not to deny God, but to misuse what he gave? The chains that bound Azazel were not merely punishment. They were prophecy, forged not to silence him alone, but to warn the generations who would inherit his fire. For when God commanded the angel Raphael to bind Azazel hand and foot and cast him into the desert of Judil, according to the book of Enoch, it was not just to bury a rebel, but to bury a reminder, to lock away a being who had taken what was sacred and scattered it among mortals, not to elevate them, but to bend them. Not to teach truth, but to intoxicate with power. And though this tale never entered the Christian canon, its shadow lingers in the ritual of the scapegoat, in the strange, unanswered name that sits in the holiest of chapters, and in the fear that knowledge may sometimes be a curse when it arrives before surrender. And this fear was not unfounded, for every time mankind has reached for the heavens without obedience, something has broken. When Nimrod built his tower, when Pharaoh claimed divinity, when sorcerers wrote their grimoires and pretended they could command angels, the echo of Azazel was there, not in the rebellion of open war, but in the quiet theft of light. And if the church removed his name, perhaps it was not out of ignorance, but out of recognition, because Azazel's crime exposes a vulnerability the church could not afford to admit. That knowledge alone is not salvation, that even sacred truths in the wrong hands become weapons. And if a heavenly being could fall simply by revealing too much too soon, then how many earthly institutions might stand guilty of the same? And so the councils canonized the cross and silenced the abyss. They chose the tale of the proud angel cast down for trying to rise too high, and ignored the angel who fell by coming too close. And while the Bible grew silent, Islam preserved the warning, not in names but in laws, not in fables but in foundations, declaring that sorcery is haram, that the unseen is not for human control, that even the Prophet Muhammad FDFA was only told what was necessary, that jinn exist but are not to be invoked, that knowledge must be taken from the purified, not the fallen. And so in Islam, the Azazel archetype is rendered powerless, not by naming him, but by sealing the doors he once opened, and the believers are told to seek refuge from the whisperer who retreats, the one who taught once with grandeur and now deceives in silence. And perhaps this is what makes Azazel's legacy most dangerous, not that he still teaches openly, but that his influence lives on in every seeker who rushes to truth without discipline, in every soul that craves hidden knowledge more than purified character, in every preacher who trades humility for performance, and every student who wants power before obedience. And so the abyss is not a prison in a desert. It is a pattern of descent that begins whenever we chase light for the wrong reasons. And though Islam never names Azazel, it closes the gates he corrupted, it blocks the paths he once cleared, and it reminds us that even angels are judged by what they do with what they know. And so the final contradiction becomes clear, not between Azazel and Iblis, but between how their stories were handled. For while Christianity silenced one and turned the other into legend, Islam clarified both, and in doing so, removed the drama and exposed the disease. And so we must ask, if Azazel was bound not for rebellion, but for instruction, if his punishment was not for pride, but for exposure, if his fall came not from denial, but from sharing what was still veiled, then what does that say about our world today, built on constant access to knowledge, drowning in unfiltered truths, guided more by data than wisdom? What if we are not suffering because we lack information, but because we were never meant to carry this much without purification? What if our collapse is not because God is silent, but because Azazel's chain is looser than we thought, and his teachings live on not in caves or scrolls, but in the hearts of those who still believe that knowing is enough? And so the final warning is not to fear what Azazel was, but to fear what we become when we follow his path and call it light. Long before the serpent slithered between the trees of Eden, before Eve reached toward the fruit or Adam was cast to the dust, there was another story buried beneath the weight of forgotten scripture, a story of eyes from the sky and fire that came not to destroy, but to desire. For in the days before the flood, when mankind still wandered in innocence, and the veil between heaven and earth was thin, the book of Enoch tells us that a group of angels descended not by command, but by choice. And these angels were called the Watchers, appointed not to interfere but to observe. Yet as they watched, they hungered not for food or power, but for beauty, for the daughters of men were fair. And the Watchers, once radiant and obedient, were consumed by longing that no heaven had permitted. And so 200 of them made a pact upon Mount Hermon, swearing to defy heaven together, that none would fall alone, and they descended into the world, not like falling stars, but like gods in disguise. And they took wives and bore children, giants of enormous size and strength, called Nephilim, whose blood tainted the earth with violence and arrogance. And this descent was not only physical but spiritual, for the Watchers brought with them knowledge forbidden to man, the arts of war, enchantment, divination, cosmetics, and the names of stars. And as their children devoured the world, the cry of creation reached heaven, and God sent angels to punish the Watchers, binding them in darkness and sealing their fate until judgment. And this story, older than the garden, is not found in the Bible's canon, though Genesis 6 briefly alludes to it, speaking cryptically of the sons of God and the daughters of men, and the giants born from their union. But the church would later reject Enoch's account, suppressing the idea that angels could fall not out of pride, but out of desire, and in doing so, shifted the origin of evil to Eden, simplifying the story to a talking serpent and a single act of disobedience. And yet the book of Enoch remained sacred in Ethiopia, quoted in Jude, known by the early church, but later declared heretical, while the true weight of the Watchers' sin was lost. And here Islam enters not to affirm every detail, but to restore the sacred order. For in the Quran, angels are described as beings who do not disobey God in what he commands, they do as they are told. And this unshakable obedience rules out the idea of lust-driven angels. But Islam does introduce Harut and Marut, two angels sent down as a test in Babylon, who taught magic to the people but warned them first. We are only a trial, so do not disbelieve. And though they are not said to have sinned with women nor fathered giants, the echoes are unmistakable, divine beings, knowledge given as a trial, mankind misusing what was sacred, and punishment not just for the act, but for what it awakened. And in this way, Islam reframes the Watcher's tale without adopting its myth, showing that the real fall was not of angels, but of man's misuse of truth. And if the Watchers are remembered as those who descended with light and left behind shadow, then Harut and Marut are remembered as those whose descent was controlled, whose mission was to expose what man desired in secret. And the difference is everything, because the Bible implies a celestial rebellion of lust and blood. But the Quran affirms a divine system that cannot be broken by desire alone, and so the Watchers may be real in symbolism, but impossible in function, and still the lesson remains. There was a time before Eden when corruption had already taken root, when the divine and the human were tangled in fire and longing. And what if this is why the serpent knew what he did? Why evil entered the garden not as invention but continuation? Because the serpent did not speak first, the Watchers did. And the sin in Eden was not the beginning but the echo of an older fall, one buried not in myth but in silence. And what if Christianity erased the Watchers because their sin was too close to human weakness? And what if Islam preserved their warning by correcting their nature? And what if the serpent was never the first to speak at all? The descent of the Watchers was not marked by fire from heaven nor by cries of rebellion. it was marked by silence, by the quiet turning of hearts that once knew only obedience. For they did not fall with swords drawn or thunder beneath their wings. They fell slowly, by gazing too long, by lingering on the beauty of what they were sent only to observe. And in that gaze, eternity bent, and what had once been pure became divided. And though the church later denied that angels could fall from lust, the book of Enoch tells otherwise, that these beings of light, drawn to the daughters of men, made a vow not in secret but in unity. For they feared not God's wrath as much as they feared falling alone, and so they made a pact together to descend. And when they came down, they came not as monsters but as gods. They taught, they ruled, they loved, and they corrupted, and the children they sired. The Nephilim were not just giants in stature but in appetite, consuming all that lay before them, turning the earth into a graveyard of human sorrow and divine regret. And it was not the sin of knowledge alone but of timing, for what was taught was not evil in itself, but it was given before mankind was ready to bear it. And in that premature revelation, wisdom became weapon, light became vanity, and the harmony between heaven and earth was torn. And though Genesis only hints at this, speaking vaguely of mighty men of old, men of renown, it offers no detail, no resolution. Only a flood that comes soon after, as if to wash away what could not be explained. And so the story of the watchers faded, and in its place grew simpler tales of snakes and trees, of a woman tempted, of a man silent, of fruit and shame. And while the serpent bore the blame, the sin behind the garden, the deeper wound, was never named. And yet in the Quran, the serpent is never given voice. And Iblis is the one who whispers, not from the body of a snake, but from a position already known, already cursed. And there is no mention of Nephilim, no union between angels and mankind, no sons of God taking daughters of men. And this is not omission, it is correction. For Islam holds that angels are made without desire, without ego, without deviation. They do not eat, they do not sleep, they do not lust, and so they cannot fall through longing. But Islam does give us the test of Harut and Marut, angels sent to Babylon with knowledge of magic, sent to expose what lies in the hearts of men, sent not as rebels but as witnesses, and their teaching was conditional, veiled in warning. Yet mankind took the knowledge, ignored the caution, and turned test into sin, and in that exchange lies the heart of the Watchers' story, preserved not through their identity but through their error. For the fall of man was not caused by divine rebellion, but by mankind misusing what came from above, and this pattern echoes through every age. For every time sacred knowledge is given, it becomes a test. Will man bow in humility or rise in arrogance? Will he honor what he is given or attempt to rule with it? And the Watchers failed by giving too freely, and mankind failed by receiving without fear. And so the abyss between heaven and earth widened, not because of hatred, but because of desire misaligned with obedience. And this is the lesson Islam affirms through different means. For even the prophet letter FDFA was commanded to seek refuge from knowledge that does not benefit, and to say, "O Allah, increase me in knowledge," not as a demand, but as a prayer, because in Islam knowledge is not right, it is trust, and the moment it becomes a tool of self rather than a path to surrender, it becomes a shadow of the Watcher's gift. And if Christianity forgot this and replaced the sin of premature revelation with a fruit and a serpent, then it replaced a cosmic warning with a myth too small to hold the weight of human corruption. And so we must ask, if the Nephilim were born of forbidden teaching, and the flood came not just to wash away sin, but to silence what the Watchers unleashed, then why is the Church silent about what once was sacred? Why does it not speak of the giants, the scrolls, the names of angels, and the curses that followed? And if Islam denies the biological fall of angels, but affirms the danger of sacred descent, then which version preserves the truth with both reverence and restraint? And what if the Watchers were real not as angels, but as a symbol of what happens every time mankind seeks heaven before he is ready? And what if the serpent was not the beginning but the echo, and the garden was not the origin of sin, but its second breath? The story of the Watchers ends not with repentance, but with silence, a silence imposed by chains. For the book of Enoch says they were bound beneath the hills of the earth, their eyes veiled, their names no longer uttered, and their children, the Nephilim, slaughtered not just by men but by the decree of heaven itself. And when the flood came, it came not only to drown sinners, but to bury the memory of those who brought heaven's fire without heaven's permission. And yet the story did not die, it lingered in whispers. In apocryphal books, in forbidden scrolls, in ancient hymns too strange for doctrine but too vivid to erase, and the paradox remains. If the angels fell for desire, if they corrupted man with forbidden wisdom, then how does heaven remain unbroken, and how do we trust what descends? And this is the fracture Christianity never fully healed, for it canonized the serpent and ignored the watchers. It declared Satan the tempter, but said nothing of those who taught man to kill, seduce, enchant, and summon. And so evil became externalized into one being rather than exposed as a system of celestial betrayal. And yet Islam solves what Christianity blurred, not by preserving every myth, but by revealing the structure behind the chaos. For in Islam, no angel rebels, no heavenly being falls through lust, no child of light descends through desire, and the order remains unshaken because obedience is built into the nature of angels. And so the chaos attributed to divine beings is re-anchored in man and jinn, those with free will, and it is they who corrupt, they who teach dark arts, they who whisper, they who fall, and by doing this, Islam not only protects the sanctity of heaven, it preserves the dignity of revelation. And this matters more than myth, because if the heavenly realm is subject to the same sins as earth, then how can we ever trust what is sent down? How can scripture remain pure and prophecy untouched? But in Islam, we are told that the angels do not disobey, and the Quran has been guarded by them, and Gabriel descended not as a watcher but as a messenger, carrying truth without deviation. And in this, Islam offers what Christianity removed, a sky that does not fall, a divine realm that is not contaminated by lust or rebellion. And in this clarity lies security, because the confusion left by the watchers breeds paranoia. It raises questions the canon never answers. If angels fell once, can they fall again? If sacred beings can be seduced, how can we know what is divine? And if giants once ruled the earth, why is the church silent on their bones, their blood, their fate? And if only Islam speaks with certainty, declaring which beings can sin and which cannot, then who truly holds the final word on what corrupted the world? And so the final contradiction is not about whether the watchers existed, but about what their story reveals about the nature of evil. Christianity tells us it came through temptation, through an animal's tongue, through a woman's weakness, but the Book of Enoch tells us it came through light, through knowledge, through sacred descent turned selfish. And Islam tells us that both stories miss the mark unless the difference between obedience and will is made clear. And so the fall before the fall is not about fruit or flesh, but about wisdom shared too early, light stolen instead of earned. Revelation unearned and abused, and in every generation since, the echoes continue. In every time knowledge is unanchored from surrender, when power is taken without purification, when what is sacred is revealed to the unready, and those who claim to lead end up corrupting, and those who seek truth without discipline end up lost in illusion. And so the watchers may be silent, but their pattern lives on, not as angels in disguise, but as men who believe they are beyond consequence, and as seekers who want light without climbing. And if Christianity erased them out of fear, and Islam warned of their principle without adopting their mythology, then the real question is not whether the watchers existed, but whether we are becoming them. And what if the greatest danger was never the serpent who spoke, but the teacher who knew better and still gave the fire away? They say the first wars were fought with stones, fists, and rage, but the Book of Enoch tells another story, a story not of tribal hatred or political ambition, but of heavenly betrayal. For it was Azazel, once a watcher among the appointed angels, who descended and gave man the tools to kill, not by instinct but by design. He taught the forging of swords, the shaping of knives, the art of armor, and the tactics of battle, and in doing so turned mankind from wanderers into warriors, from families into factions, and from innocent to corrupted by strategy. And this was not his only gift, for he also taught the beautifying of the eyelids, the use of cosmetics, enchantments, bracelets, and dyes. And while the other watchers taught astrology, charms, signs of the sky, and roots of the earth, it was Azazel who crossed the line not just by mating with the daughters of men, but by teaching them how to conquer, how to manipulate, how to dominate. And his children were not just giants but tyrants, consuming the earth with violence and taking whatever they pleased. And when the cries of blood reached heaven, it was not only man who was judged, but Azazel above all. And the book of Enoch records that God commanded the angel Raphael to bind Azazel hand and foot, cast him into the desert of Judil, and cover him with jagged stones in darkness until the great day of judgment. Because he had corrupted the world not through rebellion but through knowledge, through secrets that were not his to give. And yet, despite this catastrophic role in the origin of war and sin, the Bible makes no mention of Azazel beyond the cryptic Day of Atonement ritual, where one goat is sacrificed to God and another is sent into the wilderness for Azazel, as if sin itself is being returned to its original architect. But there is no explanation, no story, no judgment, only silence. And so Christianity remembers Cain as the first murderer, but forgets the one who gave his descendants the blade, the one who showed humanity how to refine violence into method. And while the serpent of Eden is preserved, the rebel who taught men to kill is erased. And yet in Islam, though Azazel is never named directly, the crime he committed is addressed in principle. For the Quran forbids magic, sorcery, and the use of knowledge without permission. And it speaks of those who learned from devils what would separate husband and wife, and of the people who believed they could harm others with what they learned, though it never harmed except by God's will. And it warns that those who sell their souls for knowledge earn nothing but loss in the hereafter. And the Quran mentions Harut and Marut as angels sent with a test, not to corrupt, but to expose what lay in the hearts of the people. And though they warned, mankind still took the knowledge and sinned with it. And so the Quran's message is clear. Sacred information must never be taught without sacred intention, and power without purification becomes a curse. And in this way, Islam affirms the essence of Azazel's sin, even without his name, and protects the world from repeating it, and the bold contradiction becomes clear. Christianity canonized the rebellion of Lucifer, but erased the corruption of Azazel, preserving the story of pride but silencing the warning against knowledge. And this silence left space for violence to be sanctified, for war to be baptized, and for conquest to be framed as divine, while Islam bound the gates tightly shut, forbidding the use of unseen forces, condemning the unlocking of secrets without God's permission. And what if the world we live in, full of systems built on conquest, traces back not only to Cain but to Azazel? What if the true origin of war was not jealousy, but instruction, not impulse, but forbidden knowledge shared too soon? And what if the Church's silence on Azazel is not historical forgetfulness, but doctrinal discomfort? Because if knowledge is what corrupted the world, then salvation is not belief alone. It is restraint, and Islam preserved what Christianity feared. That not all light is holy, and not every teacher is righteous, and the most dangerous rebel may not be the one who says, "I will not serve," but the one who says, "Let me show you how." The legacy of Azazel was not measured in curses alone, but in the inheritance of iron, in the transmission of technique from divine to dust. For what he taught did not vanish with his binding, it spread like wildfire through the veins of civilization, from the first forged blade that drew tribal blood to the empires that learned to melt ore into tyranny. And though his name was erased, his fingerprints remained on every battlefield, in every war cry carved with the precision of his knowledge. For Azazel's sin was not the creation of violence, but its instruction, not the birth of desire, but the offering of means. And this is what made his crime greater than Iblis. For while Iblis whispered and refused, Azazel acted and gave, and in his giving humanity was split, not between good and evil, but between instinct and calculation, between rage and strategy. And it is this calculation, this coldness wrapped in heavenly origin, that turned slaughter into science and vengeance into law. And yet the Church said nothing. Its canon kept silent while kings anointed their swords and slaughtered in God's name, while cathedrals were built beside barracks and bishops blessed the helmets of crusaders, and the name of the one who taught men war remained buried beneath centuries of doctrine. But Islam, though it never speaks his name, closes the door he once opened. It forbids magic not because it is false, but because it is real, and because it carries the same curse that Azazel unleashed. It warns against those who traffic in the unseen, who manipulate spirits, who teach the masses what was meant to be protected, and it holds that knowledge is a trust, not a weapon, and that those who are given truth without character become monsters, not messengers. And this is why the Quran speaks not only against the devils who reveal sorcery, but against the people who seek it, who forget the consequence of using what was meant to be veiled. And so while the Christian tradition built a theology around the pride of Lucifer, it failed to acknowledge the price of instruction, and this omission allowed history to repeat Azazel's fall without ever naming it, allowed the mingling of faith and violence, the marriage of altar and sword, and left generations believing that light alone sanctifies power. But Islam binds knowledge to purification, declares that ilm without taqwa is shadow, that the seeker who ascends without surrender becomes a threat to himself and others, and thus where Christianity romanticized rebellion and erased instruction, Islam restricted revelation and bound it with humility, and this becomes the crossroads where the two paths divide entirely. For if knowledge is dangerous when separated from surrender, and if Azazel's crime was not rebellion but unpermitted teaching, then the Quran's silence is not forgetfulness but mercy. And the Bible's silence is not mystery but omission, and the proof lies in the world we have built, where the tools once taught in secret now fill nations, and the sciences once veiled in angelic tongues now serve industry, war, and vanity. And if Azazel was punished for what he gave, then what does that say about those who give today, without permission, without protection, without purification? And if the Church canonized salvation through belief, while forgetting the danger of enlightenment without ethics, then it repeated Azazel's legacy under the name of redemption, and this is the contradiction that cannot be avoided. Because if the true corruption began not with denial of God, but with misuse of knowledge, then Islam preserved the wound by warning against it, while Christianity concealed the wound and celebrated the weapon. And so we must ask not who rebelled first, but who taught first, and not who killed first, but who instructed how to kill. And if the one who turned knowledge into corruption was bound in stone and cast into the earth, then perhaps our greatest sin is not violence, but the belief that knowledge alone makes us divine. And what if Azazel's chain was meant not to silence him, but to warn us that fire given without permission always becomes war? Azazel's chain may be buried beneath the stones of Judil, but the knowledge he released was never buried, never forgotten. It lives in the very sinews of civilization, in the systems that pretend to offer peace but are built upon perfected violence, in the rituals of nationhood where oaths are made over flags and weapons, and where men raise their hands to the sky not in prayer but in military salute. For Azazel's rebellion was never to challenge God's throne, but to infect what God made, to hand divine precision to unrefined hearts. And the tragedy is that humanity did not reject his gift. It mastered it, refined it, glorified it, turned it into science, theology, and tradition. And so the swords became cannons, the charms became formulas, the vanity became empires, and the same blade that was once taught by a fallen angel now passes through metal detectors outside cathedrals and mosques. And the world asks where evil comes from while bowing to the systems it birthed. And Christianity remains largely silent. It speaks of sin as personal, of salvation as internal, while ignoring that the violence that shapes the modern world began with a transmission, not a temptation, a lesson, not a serpent. And this omission has consequences, for when the doctrine fails to name the origin of structural corruption, it cannot offer protection against it. And so churches become chapels within empires, scriptures are read beside rifles. And the rebel who taught men war becomes not a villain but a ghost, forgotten while his legacy becomes law. But Islam closes that opening not with myth but with boundaries. It forbids sorcery, condemns seeking the unseen through spirits or stars, prohibits the manipulation of God's signs for worldly power, and teaches that the prophet letter FDFA did not bring magic but mercy, that knowledge must be earned, not taken, revealed, not stolen. And when the Quran speaks of those who traded their souls for harmful knowledge, it warns not only against the act, but the hunger that precedes it. And it is this hunger, this lust for power before purification, that Azazel fed. And if his punishment was eternal chaining, then the punishment of his students is still unfolding. For every time knowledge is shared without soul, when truth is packaged for profit, when war is engineered through equations instead of impulse, Azazel's fire burns again. Not in the heavens, but in hearts that carry his blueprint, and if Christianity cannot name him, then it cannot bind him, and if it cannot bind him, then it leaves its people defenseless against the very darkness they weaponize, and so the contradiction deepens, for Islam silences what should be silent, while the church remains quiet about what still speaks. And if both claim to follow revelation, then we must ask, which revelation protected us? Which revelation recognized that sacred power must be sealed? And what if salvation is not merely escape from hell, but protection from knowledge that burns the world in disguise? And what if the Day of Atonement goat was more than symbol? What if the sins cast upon it were meant to return to their origin, and that origin was not Eden, but Azazel? And what if the wilderness it was driven into was not random, but ritual, and the ritual was memory? A memory too dangerous to name, and so the church named Lucifer and crucified pride, but forgot the one who taught men to draw blood with beauty, to summon death with knowledge, and to transform the world into a battlefield wrapped in scripture. And if Islam preserved the warning, though never the name, then perhaps it is not the text with the longer story that tells the greater truth, but the one that knew what to keep hidden. And if Azazel is to remain forgotten, let it be by design, not by erasure. And if his story is to be remembered, let it be as a warning that some rebellions do not begin with a roar, but with a whisper of instruction. And the deadliest knowledge is always the one that arrives before the heart is ready to obey. The world has long been taught that Lucifer was the first to fall, the original rebel, the morning star cast down from heaven for exalting himself above the throne of the Most High. Yet that story is built on fragments, echoes, and interpretations more than scripture. For the Bible never clearly names Lucifer in Eden, nor does it connect the serpent to the devil until centuries later through theological stitching. And meanwhile, buried beneath the canon, lies an older, stranger, more dangerous tale. The story of the sons of God, those divine beings who, according to Genesis 6, saw the daughters of men, found them fair, and took them as wives. And from their union came giants, Nephilim, men of renown, and in that single paragraph rests a cosmic catastrophe, quietly declared, swiftly passed, with no judgment given, no names listed, no consequences explained. And yet the book of Enoch opens that silence into thunder, declaring that these sons of God were angels called watchers, appointed to observe but never interfere. And their fall came not from pride like Iblis, but from desire, longing, and the hunger to experience what was forbidden to their kind. And when they descended upon Mount Hermon, they made an oath together that none would act alone. And this collective rebellion formed the first covenant against heaven. And what followed was the corruption of mankind, not by temptation, but by intimacy, not by deception, but by revelation, as they taught humanity charms, enchantments, metallurgy, signs of the stars, and the hidden workings of the earth, and through them war, vanity, and sorcery entered the world. And yet the church, needing a single devil to shoulder the theology of sin, erased these beings, edited their story, suppressed Enoch, and elevated Lucifer to the role of cosmic scapegoat, even as the ritual of the scapegoat on the Day of Atonement preserved the name of another, Azazel, sent into the wilderness bearing the sins of Israel. And still Christianity kept silent on these sons of God who broke the boundary between heaven and earth, while Islam, without confirming the details, corrects the doctrine with a structural safeguard, for the Quran is clear. Angels do not sin, they do not disobey, they do not desire, and they do not fall, and the being who refused to bow, Shaitan, Iblis, was not an angel but a jinn made of smokeless fire, given free will and tested alongside the obedient host. And this distinction protects the divine order. It affirms that what comes from heaven is guarded, and what descends into sin belongs to those created with choice. And this reframes the rebellion of Genesis not as a divine collapse, but a misreading of boundaries. And so where the Bible leaves open the possibility of divine beings falling through desire, Islam closes the door with purpose, stating that angels are beings of light with no ego, no lust, and no deviation from command. And this matters because it preserves the purity of revelation, the reliability of messengers, the consistency of divine order. And it explains why the Quran never speaks of sons of God mating with humans, never speaks of Nephilim, never speaks of giants born from heavenly seed, because to affirm such a thing would blur the line between creator and creation, between command and chaos. And while Christianity allowed that line to smudge in favor of narrative drama, Islam preserved it with theological precision. And so the contradiction becomes one of cosmology. Did sin begin from pride or from desire? From the serpent or from the watchers, from Iblis alone or from a host of divine beings who fell before him? And if Lucifer was not the first, then why is his name the only one preserved? And if the sons of God fell first, then why are they absent from the theology of original sin? And what if the reason is not forgetfulness but fear? For a theology built on the singular fall of one cannot afford to admit that the heavens bled twice. And what if Islam, in rejecting both the fall of angels and the intermingling of heaven and earth, preserved not only the oneness of God, but the order of creation? And what if the greatest fall was not pride or lust, but the fall of theology itself, collapsing under the weight of stories that were never meant to agree? The idea that Lucifer was the first to rebel has been so deeply woven into Christian consciousness that to challenge it feels like blasphemy, yet the scriptures themselves speak more softly than the doctrine they inspired. For when Genesis tells us that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives, it does not condemn them, it does not name them, and it does not warn against them. And yet the consequences follow immediately, for in the very next breath, God declares, "My spirit shall not strive with man forever," and the flood is set into motion, as if this celestial trespass triggered the unraveling of creation's innocence, and the world that was declared good became irredeemable almost overnight. And while Christian tradition focuses on mankind's wickedness, Enoch tells us that it was the watchers who poisoned the roots, that it was their descent which turned man from creature to consumer, that their offspring, the Nephilim, brought war, blood, and hunger that could not be satisfied, and that Azazel in particular corrupted humanity by teaching them forbidden arts, from the forging of blades to the painting of eyes. And yet the Church, in its councils and creeds, chose to silence this story, to bury it beneath the rise of a theology that required one devil and one fall. And so Lucifer became the villain of all time, while the earlier and more devastating fall of the sons of God was locked away in forgotten books. And Islam, without adopting the tale, still offers a deeper correction, for the Quran does not describe angels falling or taking wives or siring giants, because it does not permit that confusion to exist. Angels in Islam are without desire, without ego, and without sin, and the Quran is careful in its language, naming Iblis not as an angel but as a jinn, and stating that he was among the angels when the command was given, but not of their kind. And this precise wording prevents the entire crisis that Christianity never resolved. For if angels can fall, who guards the revelation, who keeps the heavens pure, who delivers prophecy without corruption? And if sacred beings are capable of lust and rebellion, then the entire architecture of divine order collapses, and Islam refuses to entertain such a contradiction. Instead, it redefines the rebellion not as a war in heaven, but as a refusal on earth. Not a fall from grace by angelic beings, but a test failed by a jinn, and in doing so, it preserves the sanctity of the divine and the integrity of creation. And this is not just a matter of cosmology, it is a matter of trust. For if God sends messengers, they must be unbreakable, and if his servants in heaven are to preserve the Quran, they must be incapable of betrayal. And if we are to believe in revelation, we must believe it has been untouched by lust, pride, and confusion. And Christianity, by permitting the fall of angels, forfeits this assurance and builds its theology on the ruins of order, and the contradictions ripple outward. For if the watchers fell before Lucifer, then Lucifer is not the origin of evil, he is a successor to it. And if evil predates Eden, then Eden is not the beginning but a continuation. And if divine beings intermingled with humanity, then the lines between heaven and earth, creator and creation, divine and human, are irreparably blurred. And if theology requires those lines to remain sharp, then Islam stands alone in defending them. And so the question deepens, not only of who fell first, but of what was lost in the process. And if Christianity removed the Watchers because their story was too threatening, too strange, too celestial, then it replaced complexity with simplicity, but simplicity cannot sustain truth when the world bleeds with paradox, and so the Quran. Though it never mentions the Watchers, restores their lesson in its silence, it corrects their theology by refusing to deify knowledge or demonize order, and by keeping the heavens whole, it makes the earth accountable, and this is where the path divides. For Christianity created a war above to explain the war below, while Islam preserved the calm above to teach man to master himself. And if evil came from a heavenly fall, then we are victims of a cosmic accident. But if evil came from within, from pride, from refusal, from misuse of trust, then we are not victims, we are witnesses. And if the sons of God fell first, then the story of the serpent was already old when he whispered. And what if Eden was not the scene of the first fall, but the aftermath of a greater one, a fall not of man alone, but of those who should have known better? And if Islam guarded that gate, while Christianity blurred it, then we must ask, which story truly protects the throne of God, and which one lets it shatter? The silence surrounding the sons of God is not a silence of absence, but a silence of removal, a deliberate forgetting shaped by councils and creeds, because their fall complicates the Christian structure of evil. For if these divine beings fell before Lucifer, if they were the first to descend and defile, then Lucifer is dethroned as the origin of rebellion, and Eden is no longer the birthplace of corruption, but only a chapter in a longer fall. And that undermines everything the Church built its doctrine upon. For how can one Redeemer atone for a world broken by many rebellions? And how can salvation be traced to a single act if sin was seeded by celestial lust and hidden instruction long before Eve reached for the fruit? And so the Watchers were cut out, their names erased, their scrolls burned or buried, and Lucifer was lifted as the sole villain, the cosmic traitor who bore all blame. And yet the blood of the Nephilim cries from beneath the flood, and the rituals of Azazel remain in the Torah's oldest pages, and the Book of Enoch survives in the canons of Ethiopia and the whispers of scholars, telling us that the fall was deeper, wider, and older than we were taught, and that the heavens cracked not once but many times, not from pride but from desire, not from hatred but from curiosity, and Islam answers this rupture not with replacement but with correction. For the Quran does not adopt the Watchers, it denies the possibility altogether. It tells us angels are pure, created to obey, and incapable of sin. It draws a line in creation that cannot be crossed, a barrier between the unseen and the mortal, a veil between the divine and the corruptible, and in doing so it rescues revelation from suspicion, it guards the heavens from human scandal, and it preserves Tawheed, the absolute oneness and perfection of God. Not only in divinity but in command, for if those who dwell in his presence can fall, then his authority is flawed, and Islam cannot accept that. And so it redefines the rebellion as an act of jinn, not angels, as a refusal rooted in arrogance, not desire. And in this clarity is security, because a pure heaven produces a trustworthy revelation, and a trustworthy revelation creates a stable bridge between the Creator and the created. But Christianity, by allowing the fall of the sons of God, leaves the heavens wounded, and the world ruled by shadows of ancient celestial crimes. And that worldview does not end at theology. It seeps into culture, into art, into fear, where demons are former angels, and the world is a battleground between light that can fall and darkness that once shined. And this tension creates believers who fear what they worship and question what they trust. But Islam removes that tension by protecting the order of creation, by never permitting heaven to collapse, and instead placing all rebellion on earth, all failure within the human and jinn domains, where free will was designed to exist. And so the responsibility remains ours, and the heavens remain whole, and in that structure is peace, and in that peace is justice, because no sin has stained the throne, and no angel has ever lied, and no messenger has ever corrupted. And so the question is no longer who fell first, but who still allows the fallen to define the faith. And if the sons of God fell before Lucifer, and the Church erased them to preserve simplicity, and Islam rejected them to preserve sovereignty, then which path has truly honored the integrity of the divine? And what if the first fall was not of pride or lust, but of theology itself, collapsing under its own contradictions? And what if the serpent's whisper was only a shadow of an older voice, and the garden was not the beginning, but the inheritance of a forgotten descent? And if Islam preserved the line between heaven and earth while Christianity blurred it, then we must ask with sobering clarity, which story heals the fracture, and which one was built on its silence? They were called the Watchers not because they ruled, but because they were told only to see, appointed as guardians of the threshold between heaven and earth, assigned not to interfere, but to observe the unfolding of mankind's destiny from a distance. Yet the story that emerged from ancient scrolls tells us that their eyes did more than witness. They longed, they lingered, and from that lingering came the betrayal that would stain both earth and memory. For in the book of Enoch, it is recorded that these angels, divine in form and radiant in origin, looked upon the daughters of men and found in them a beauty that pierced the veil of obedience, and what began as observation turned into desire, and desire turned into descent, not by accident but by pact. For they gathered atop Mount Hermon and swore an oath that none would fall alone. And together they descended, 200 strong, crossing the line heaven had never permitted, taking wives among mortals and fathering children who were not simply giants but symbols of corruption. And these Nephilim grew in strength and pride and appetite, devouring all that lay before them, and the world bent beneath the weight of their hunger and violence. And yet the story was never preserved in the Christian canon. For while Genesis 6 briefly mentions that the sons of God took wives from the daughters of men and produced mighty men of old, it offers no context, no judgment, and no names, and the early church, perhaps unsettled by the implications, removed Enoch from its sacred texts, turning what had once been common knowledge into forbidden law. And so the betrayal of the Watchers was buried, while the rebellion of Lucifer was exalted. But the scars of their fall remain, echoed in mythologies of demigods and monsters, in ancient fears of beings from the sky who taught man to summon spirits, read stars, and wield iron like divine fire. And while Christianity sanitized its heavens to make room for a singular Satan, it left behind the unanswered question: why did God send the flood if not to cleanse the sins that began before Adam ever left Eden? And Islam, without naming the Watchers, answers the question by redefining the structure, declaring that angels do not sin, they do not desire, and they do not fall, and in this protection lies resolution. For Islam refuses to allow divine messengers to cross boundaries that would make revelation suspect, instead placing the potential for sin only within jinn and men, the two creations endowed with free will, and by doing so, it heals what the Watcher's tale had fractured, a cosmos where heaven bleeds into earth, where sacred beings become predators, and divine knowledge becomes a drug passed to the unready, and the Quran seals that door firmly shut, allowing no confusion, affirming that those who descend with God's word do so under his command alone, without deviation. And so while Enoch tells us of angels who fell through desire, Islam tells us that such a fall is not possible, that what the Watchers represent is not a literal event, but a warning of what happens when sacred roles are confused with human hunger. And in this difference lies everything, for Christianity chose to silence the story, while Islam chose to prevent its possibility. And so we must ask not only who the Watchers were, but why their betrayal remains unspoken, and what it reveals about our understanding of sin, trust, and divine order. And what if their story is not about angels at all, but about us, about what happens when we look upon what is meant to be watched and decide to reach, when we turn observation into possession, when the sacred duty to guard becomes the cursed temptation to take. And if Islam preserved the boundary while Christianity allowed the story to fade into shadows, then who truly remembered the meaning of the Watchers' fall, and who repeated it? The betrayal of the Watchers was not one of open defiance, but of silent dissent, not a war declared in heaven, but a whisper that pulled the stars downward. For they were never meant to interfere, only to guard, never meant to touch, only to witness, and yet desire kindled where it never should have existed, not in lustful rebellion, but in the longing to become part of what they were meant to protect. And that is what made their fall more terrifying than Lucifer's pride, for Lucifer's sin was loud and proud. A refusal to bow, a claim to be greater, But the Watchers fell without resistance. They fell for beauty, for curiosity, for love twisted into possession. And in doing so they brought heaven too close to earth and blurred the very line that kept creation safe. And the Book of Enoch tells us that their children, the Nephilim, were not merely giants in flesh, but devourers of the earth, consuming both nature and man with their hunger, destroying harmony with strength, and defiling balance with blood. And the Watchers themselves taught mankind what was not yet ready to be known, taught them metalwork, enchantment, cosmetics, astrology, and war. And while the Christian Bible omits their names and truncates their crimes, Islam prevents their very possibility by closing the heavens to sin, declaring angels as pure servants of God who do not act on desire, do not possess free will, and cannot fall. And so the story of the Watchers in Islam becomes a mirror turned away. A path that never existed, a crack that was never permitted to form, and instead of Watchers who fell, Islam gives us Harut and Marut, two angels sent to Babylon as a test, not as traitors, and they warned humanity of the danger of what they carried, saying clearly, "We are only a trial, so do not disbelieve." And yet mankind still took what was offered and turned trial into temptation and knowledge into curse, and that is where the stories converge. Not in characters, but in consequence, for whether Watchers or warnings, the truth remains. When knowledge is divorced from obedience, it becomes corruption. When light is shared without surrender, it becomes shadow. And this is why the Quran forbids magic, sorcery, and the seeking of unseen power, not because these things are false, but because they are real, and real danger wrapped in premature access. And what the Book of Enoch accuses Azazel and his brethren of doing, Islam prevents by law, by theology, and by structure, and in doing so preserves what Christianity failed to protect: a pure heaven, a guarded revelation, and a line that must never be crossed. And the tragedy is that the church had the story, it held the scrolls, it read Enoch, it quoted him in Jude. But when the time came to canonize the narrative, it chose to simplify the fall, to isolate the serpent, and to erase the Watchers, perhaps because their sin was too close to human institutions. How can one preach purity from the pulpit while holding a blade forged by a fallen angel? How can one declare holiness while using the tools taught by traitors from above? And so the narrative was narrowed, and the betrayal of the Watchers was hidden beneath ritual and myth. But Islam exposed the pattern by preventing its foundation, stating clearly that angels cannot desire, cannot choose, and cannot fail. And in that rejection lies protection, and in that protection lies the power to trust revelation. And the messenger letter FDFA is described not as one corrupted by unseen beings, but as one guarded by angels, reciting what was revealed by Jibril, who brought the Quran not as a rogue spirit, but as a trusted bearer of truth. And in this clarity, Islam restores what the Watchers' betrayal had broken, the sacred trust between heaven and earth, and so the contradiction becomes final and unavoidable. Christianity preserved the names of the fallen, yet forgot the warning, while Islam removed the names, yet preserved the wisdom. And what if that wisdom is all that ever mattered? What if the real betrayal is not in the descent of angels, but in the elevation of knowledge without reverence? And what if every war, every injustice, every exploitation of divine truth echoes not the serpent's lie, but the Watcher's gift? And what if that gift is still being passed hand to hand, behind robes and altars, behind policies and pulpits, and the only thing that ever truly stopped them was not chains, but the word that said angels never fall? The Watchers were never meant to be remembered, not because they were unimportant, but because they were inconvenient, too celestial to condemn outright, too corrupted to preserve within holy memory, and so Christianity buried them in half verses and removed their names from doctrine, while canonizing only the echoes of their consequences: the flood without its cause, the war without its architects, and while Lucifer was painted as the singular traitor, the first and greatest enemy. The sons of God who fell from heaven out of longing were erased, their betrayal locked away in the Apocrypha, their crimes reduced to mystery, and their legacy mistaken for myth. But the Book of Enoch preserved what the councils feared: that the fall began not with pride, but with affection, not with ambition, but with desire, and that this desire once entered into the hearts of beings created to observe, not act, to protect, not possess, and when the Watchers descended, They did not rebel with declarations, but with longing, and that longing shattered the distance between heaven and earth. And what followed was not just sin, but contamination, not just the birth of giants, but the death of boundaries. For the Nephilim devoured the earth, and their fathers taught the secrets of heaven to minds unprepared. And that transmission of unearned knowledge did more than awaken men. It ruined them. For when man learns before he surrenders, he becomes not enlightened, but dangerous. And so God commanded that the watchers be bound beneath the earth until the day of judgment, and that the flood would cleanse the abominations born of their union. And yet none of this remains in the Christian canon, none of this is recited in churches, because to speak of angels falling for women is to admit that heaven itself once bled. And if heaven bleeds, then revelation is never safe, and prophecy is always suspect. But Islam guarded against this not by preserving the watchers, but by never allowing them to exist. And in that denial lies strength, for the Quran never permits angels to disobey, never allows divine beings to fall into lust, never lets heaven collapse into earth except by God's command. And this theological structure does more than correct myth. It protects trust, for revelation must come from uncorrupted hands, and prophecy must be received in purity. And if the messengers fall, then the message falls with them. And Islam refuses to allow that fall, placing all sin, all testing, all free will within the realms of man and jinn alone. And in doing so, it seals heaven behind an unbreakable veil, while Christianity left a door open it could no longer close. And so the question is not whether the watchers fell, but why Christianity chose to forget them, and why Islam never needed to remember them. And what if that silence is not a contradiction, but a verdict? And what if the final betrayal was not their descent, but the elevation of their story into sacred memory? For a faith that builds on fallen angels builds on broken pillars, and a faith that denies their fall protects the throne itself. And if the watchers were real, then they were not just rebels, they were a warning. And if they were myth, then they are still a mirror, reflecting what happens when sacred knowledge is pursued without surrender, when divine roles are confused with human hunger. And if Christianity mourns their memory in silence, while Islam guards against their return, then the final contrast is clear. One preserved their story but lost the boundary, the other protected the boundary and needed no story. And if the betrayal of the watchers teaches us anything, it is that desire is not always loud, and evil is not always pride, and rebellion does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears a gaze. And sometimes all it takes to ruin heaven's peace is to love what was never yours to touch. And so the last question remains not whether angels can fall, but whether we still remember why they were told only to watch.